So I think I've done a few of these talks. I think some of you have heard me, so you know a little bit more about my background. So I'm excited again to share my adventures from Australia with you and kind of relive these really great memories from our trips from 2017 and 2018. We took 2 3-week trips. So this presentation is kind of a best of from those 2 trips. I was actually in the midst of planning another trip to Australia, to more of the northeast part of the country, when the pandemic hit. And, you know, slowly we were canceling trip by trip, and it became eventually apparent that we weren't going to get back there this year. So definitely fingers crossed for vaccines and being able to do a little bit more traveling this year. But I'm sure some of you have probably been to Australia and maybe even to some of these places that I'll be talking about today. So I hope you enjoy the talk. I'm big on maps also, just to let you know. So a lot of as I sort of go from place to place, I sort of introduce it with a map and kind of talk about it a little bit. Australia, I think probably many of you know, is a land like no other. It has about 1 million different native species, and more than 80% of the country's flowering plants, mammals, and reptiles are unique to Australia, along with half of its birds. And so, hang on. Okay. Sorry, I'm just having a little technical glitch here. Its geographical isolation, being an island and a continent and very isolated from the rest of the world, has resulted in flora and fauna that's largely endemic, which means that it only occurs there. However, some closely related species are found on the continents of South America, Africa, India, and Antarctica, which are part of relic populations from when there was the ancient supercontinent Gondwana. So there's remnant rainforests in Australia that includes plants that are related to other plants in those countries. Knowing all that, it's sort of hard to decide where to go and how to plan a trip on a country and a continent, or country that's close in size to the United States. So on our first trip, we basically narrowed it down. We flew into Melbourne in the south part of the country and decided to do a road trip a little bit to the west along the coast, and then up to Sydney, which amounted to about a 1,500-mile road trip. The first part of the journey led us to the Great Ocean Road. So Melbourne is kind of up there on the upper right of the picture, and we drove southwest along the Great Ocean Road into the Great Otway National Park. This is just a spectacular ocean drive. And if you have the Microsoft system, you may have seen that the 12 apostles pop up when you open your computer and you get those really spectacular images. They're a beautiful series of sea stacks that are along the road that have been isolated due to erosion from the sandstone shoreline. And so, like I say, for anyone who loves a scenic drive or hike along the coast, this is definitely a must-see. It took most of the day to get there because the roads are super windy and not very fast. So we didn't get out there that day, and it rained overnight, and we weren't really sure what the vistas were going to be like the next day. It was really foggy, but the light was beautiful, and it ended up, clearing to be just a spectacular day. So we had beautiful, beautiful views. And what's interesting is there aren't 12 of these sea stacks. There used to be 8, and one was knocked over sometime I guess in 2005 due to erosion. But we've learned that they have had a variety of names over the years. And the 12 Apostles was adopted as their formal name, I believe, sometime in the 70s. So not 12, but equally, but a stunning view along the way. Also along the way, the park has beautiful coastal hiking that you can do as a multi-day backpack, or you could do as isolated just day hikes, which we did quite a few of. And also along the way are spectacular arches that rival anything that we have in the desert. And it's pretty spectacular to watch these large ocean surf crash through these giant arches along the way. So a super spectacular area. Also along the way, we went to the Great Otway National Park, which is an area where you can see koala bears in their native habitat. They reside in, forest settings, so it's pretty dense and it's hard for amateur photographers like us to get really good images. And I'm often just happy to watch them through the binoculars. But the majority of their diet is eucalyptus leaves from very specific tree species. So they can't just be anywhere. And although they were native to Eastern Australia, they've actually been located in several other areas in the country to promote conservation, because they are an endangered species. Or I'm not sure if they're currently endangered, but the population is not as robust as it once was. They spend most of their time sleeping, around 20 hours per day, and only feed for a few hours a day. One interesting thing, they have 2 thumbs and 3 fingers on each forepaw. I think you can see the 2 thumbs in one picture and the 3 forefingers in the other, which allows them to grip tightly in the trees. And they really are adorable. They don't have very good eyesight, but they have excellent smell. So it enables them to sniff out the most highly, highest quality eucalyptus leaves for them to eat. Their babies are called joeys, and they're born just about a month after fertilization, and they spend the first 22 weeks in mom's pouch as they develop. And they will emerge fully at about 36 weeks, where they hang out on mom's back before they can be fully weaned and on their own. And I think probably you all know that koalas are part of the marsupials, and half of the mammal species in Australia are marsupials, which are really, really interesting animals to study. Also, there's several really beautiful walks that just go through the ancient rainforest areas, and there's a series of really beautiful waterfalls. So the Otway National Park was a lot of diversity. You've got the coastal areas and these rich rainforest areas and the eucalyptus forests, all in a really small concentrated area. So it was definitely worth the adventure out. In 2018, when we flew back into Melbourne, we actually traveled east to Phillip Island, and then further down to where it says Tidal River. That's the home of the Wilson's Promontory National Park. I had really wanted to go to Phillip Island in 2017 because that's where the penguin colonies are, and I love seeing the penguins, but it just didn't happen. So in 2018, we got to go there. The little penguin is the smallest of the 18 penguin species, and it's distinguished by its blue feathers. And Phillip Island has the largest colony at about 32,000 birds. And each night they have the March of the Penguins. It's a nightly parade when the penguins are returning from sea, where they can spend up to a month out feeding. As they return from the feeding areas, they form rafts, large groups just offshore, and then for protection, and then they come to shore in these groups to protect from predation. So that's kind of where they get the nightly March of the Penguins. So visitors can watch this nightly march, and this picture here shows the stands of where visitors can sit. You go out there just before sunset and get all set up with a naturalist who gives us, information about the ecology and conservation of the penguins in the area. And then you just kind of sit and wait in anticipation. And as night falls, the magic happens and the little penguins come out of the water. It's really kind of an amazing thing. And they're just these little tiny things waddling about, and you get to watch them. Visitors aren't allowed to photograph the penguins during the penguin march because they're really concerned about all the flashes and how that might affect them. So what they enable you to do is just go to their site and download all of their, the pictures that you want for free. So these are their stock pictures. They're not mine. But you can, they're get to see. So I'm just going to back out of this presentation for a small minute, because like everywhere else, the penguin parade went viral this year because of COVID-19. And as I was putting this together, I came upon this link of an otherwise unemployed sports announcer who decided he was going to take it upon himself to narrate the penguin parade. So if you just bear with me for a minute, there's a short ad. This is only a minute video, but it is really adorable. So I just had to show you.
Claudette, we're still just seeing the presentation screen.
What's that?
We're still just seeing your presentation screen.
Oh no, you're not seeing this?
No.
Oh no. I'm not sure why you're not seeing this. Are you seeing it now?
No, it's still your.
Oh shoot. Okay. Oh, I don't know. Oh, that's too bad. So you couldn't see any of that?
No.
Okay. Oh, that's really too bad. Maybe I'll just send the link and you guys can watch it later because it's really kind of hysterical. Sorry about that. Okay, we'll go back to complete slide here. Oh, shoot. Anyway, while we were there, at the time of the year that we were there in November, it's actually the molting season. So a lot of them, if they're not, they don't, while they're molting, they're not out at sea feeding because they don't have the waterproofness from when they're molting their feathers. So they're just hanging out in their nests and sleeping, and there's trails all throughout their nests. And amazingly, you can get really close to them. I mean, of course, this is telephoto, but you can just walk all along and see them just kind of resting in their nesting spots. And then during the day, you can walk down on the beach and check out all their little waddling footprints and see, you know, where they've been and where they've been marching. In addition to the penguins, this area is also home to millions of breeding short-tailed shearwaters, and they migrate down from the Aleutian Islands to Phillip Island and surrounding islands in September to nest and rear their young. And they return to Alaska in April and May, and they feed on krill, so they're ocean feeders, and they leave their nests at pre-dawn and they return at sunset. And we got up really early to try to go see them as they go off and get food. But I'm not a real early riser, so we only saw a few fleeting birds left. But this is them. These are some other pictures that I was able to download of the bird from one of the articles that I read. And interestingly, and somewhat sadly, as I was looking for information on these birds, I came across an article that was discussing the recent decline in numbers returning to breed. From what I can gather, they're having a hard time getting enough krill up in Alaska because the sea temperatures are warming so much that it's affecting the krill populations. So as a result, they can't get enough body fat and body weight for the long migrations. And many of the birds that, even if they make it, are dying before they can actually breed. And this has been going on, really steep declines for the last 2 years. And scientists are becoming really concerned that this annual migration of literally millions of birds may be coming to an end, or certainly declining rapidly. So they're doing a lot of monitoring and trying to understand, you know, what's going on with the populations. From there, we went down to the Wilson's Promontory National Park, which is home to the eastern gray kangaroo. And they're part of several ecological studies on population dynamics and foraging behaviors. As climate change affects weather patterns and vegetation, scientists are studying how the populations there may be affected. And one of the things that they do is they put collars and ear tags on them, and they're in distinct patterns so they know which individuals they're looking at. And in that way, you know, as they're studying their observations, they know which individuals they're watching. Interestingly, you know, if you've been to Australia, you probably know this, but Aussies have a real kind of love-hate relationship with their kangaroos because they're often considered pests in agricultural areas. So there's a lot of efforts being made to make sure that they can have some preserved areas in these national park settings for, you know, future protection. And like many areas, this park also has, you know, a whole set of trails on some really spectacular coastal areas. This was a, what do I want to say, waterway that we went down, an estuary river that we were able to hike down and follow the trail out to the shore. And for the most part, we often had these beaches to ourselves, which, you know, is just mind boggling because if you travel to our beaches here in the States, they're just always packed. So it was always really beautiful to just be able to go out and have these really gorgeous beach walks. In 2017, we, as part of our trip, we went over to the Snowy Range, which is also referred to as the Australian Alps, because we had to climb the highest point in the country, which is Mount Kosciuszko. It's only 7,310 feet, which by our standards is hardly a peak at all, but it is their tallest mountain, and it is alpine zone. So off we went. And as we drove from Melbourne up, you go through a lot of agricultural areas. There's a lot of tree farming, a lot of wheat and grain production, and of course, a lot of sheep farming. And then we took the little mini roads through all of the different eucalyptus forests to get to Kosciuszko. It's a beautiful hike. You start in a ski town and you hike up and you're in alpine pretty quickly. And so it's interesting that the peak got its name from a Polish explorer in the 1840s who was naming it after a freedom fighter, a Polish freedom fighter. And I guess it looks similar to a feature in Krakow, Poland. So it's interesting that how these places get their names, but it's stuck over the years. It's gone through a few changing of spellings, but it's got its name. One other thing about the ski areas in this area, because Mount Kosciuszko itself is not the ski area, but within this area of the Australian Alps, there are several ski areas. And I believe they belong to the Epic Pass system. So you can ski in the States at the Epic Pass areas, you know, in the winter here, and then go down here in July and ski here if you have an Epic Pass, if that's something that interests you. Prior to 1977, you could actually drive to the top, but because of ecological concerns, they closed that road and made it into a bike and walking path. And they also put in hardened structures to funnel people in, you know, on a hardened path, because as you guys know here, I'm sure you've all been up into the mountains, it doesn't take much to impact the fragile alpine ecosystem. You know, it erodes easily. It doesn't recover very quickly because it's dry and cold. So most the entire trail is on some kind of hardened surface. And it's quite a busy place. So it's rare that you get the top to yourself, especially in the summer. But, you know, you're just out there, and a lot of times we're not looking for solitude in these places that we go to. We're just happy to be there and enjoy the sights. So we had, you know, we were lucky to have a really beautiful day to get up there and enjoy it with everybody else. One of the things, and I think you probably know, that my husband is an avid butterfly person. And so as we travel, he's always looking out for butterflies. And because we knew this part of Australia has mostly browns, not the big colorful ones like the tropical part of the country up in the northeast, we decided to just keep taking pictures of them, even though to me they all looked alike. I kept encouraging him to take pictures of everything he saw. And what we ended up seeing when he was able to key them out at home, this is an orange alpine Zeneca, a shouldered brown, a spotted brown, a common brown, and a spotted brown. To me, they pretty much all look the same. But what we discovered when we came home is we found this picture in one of his butterfly books that sort of show the variation along the elevation and ecological gradient among the brown species. So basically Eden, that you can see is on the lower right of this, Eden is sea level. So this is showing variation over two things, going from sea level inland and then going up in elevation to the top of Mount Kosciuszko. And the different species that that are found along the way. So this ended up being really helpful for him, understanding what we were seeing and where we were seeing and why it was worth taking a picture of every brown butterfly that we saw on everywhere that we went. So you never know. A lot of the butterflies are very tied to their specific eucalyptus forests. And they're also called gum trees, and they're the icon of the Australian flora. They've got more than 800 species, and they dominate the Australian landscape, forming dense woodlands, deep forests, shrublands, and all environments throughout Australia, except in the interior, really hot and arid areas. It was confusing because some of the common names are also called ash trees. And as you might suspect, they look nothing like our ash trees. So until we read more and sort of understood a little bit more about the eucalyptus, the ash tree thing was really throwing us. But also try as we may, I mean, with hundreds of species, it's really hard to try to figure out which ones are which. They're highly adapted to dry environments and also fire. One of the things is that the young plants have these rounded leaves, rounded light colored leaves that are really good at absorbing sun. And as the tree matures, they turn into sort of more of the elongated drop leaves that you pretty much are familiar with on the eucalyptus trees. They also have this thing called the lignotuber, which are these real round bulbous things you see at the root of the trees that enable them to resprout after after periods of drought or periods of fire. And the other thing that they can do is they have dormant buds under the bark that will also sprout after drought or fire. So they're pretty highly adapted to these dry conditions that have returning fire intervals. This is a picture of a recovering snow gum. The snow gum is the alpine, one of the alpine species, and it's almost like a dwarf, more like a shrub species. And this area burned, I can't remember exactly when, but you know, it's a recovering burn. But one of the things that I learned also, because I was curious about the fires, is how fire is affecting the trees. So this map shows the fire locations from the 2019 fire season, and of course we were inundated by some of these images on even our news here in the States. These fires weren't burning all at the same time, but they just show the locations of where fires burned in 2019. So you can see a lot of the country burned. And it was pretty devastating for a lot of areas because most of the people live along the coast. One of the things that scientists are kind of concerned about is eucalyptus forests take about 20 years to fully recover from a fire event. But what they're finding in some forest areas as temperatures dry, especially you know, as climate changes, is that the fire return interval is shortening. So rather than having fires spread out over longer periods of time, areas are experiencing repeat burns in really short fire cycles, like 5 to 8 years. And so scientists aren't sure if these forests are going to be able to recover, you know, to the extent that they were before. And kind of like the fire talk that I gave you folks earlier this summer, you know, we're sort of looking at that same thing with some of our forest types, where either they have return intervals that are too short or just dry conditions that will no longer support those trees. And if you look at this fire map, it really corresponds with where the majority of the eucalyptus forests are in the country. So there's some real concern with the future of the extent of eucalyptus forest types in the country. So from there, in 2018, after leaving the coastal area, we flew down to Tasmania. And that was another place that was really on my wish list of places to go. And so two things primarily that we did down there is we hiked on what's called the Overland Trek. And that is a 6-day hike that goes from Cradle Mountain through Cradle Mountain St. Clair National Park and comes out at St. Clair Lake. And then the other thing that we did was then we drove south to Port Arthur, which is the site of the prison colony that was down there. So the Overland Trek is about a 40-mile, 5 to 6-day trek that goes from the alpine area of Cradle Mountain down to St. Clair Lake. And this area has an incredibly rich history tied to Aboriginal peoples, as well as miners and explorers in the 1800s. In the 1920s, it was deemed a valuable area for its rich history and pristine natural conditions and wildlife values, and was set aside as a scenic reserve and wildlife sanctuary. And from there, it became a national park in 1947. So this area has a series of public huts that you can stay in or use for day use. But we opted to go with the Tasmanian Walking Company, which owns a series of private huts that are found along the route. And part of the reason is coming from the States, we just didn't want to bring all our backpacking gear. And they provided some really important equipment, including really nice day packs, super duper raincoats, which it turns out you need, and all the overnight gear that was available to us at the huts. And best of all, they provided all the meals. So we didn't have to do any cooking. And when I say meals, the food was fabulous. If you've, spent any time out in the wild, that there's problem critters. We've got marmots and bears and things. Well, there they have a thing called the Currawong, which is a crow-like animal that is quite adept at getting into your pack and getting any food that you might leave. So we had to learn pretty quickly not to leave our snacks accessible to these guys because they would just tear into things. But other than that, the hike started off, just beautiful. You get right up into the alpine. This is Cradle Lake. We were really fortunate because Tasmania can get a lot of rain. So, the early part of our trip was just spectacular. And you're going through these alpine areas, a lot of boardwalks. Again, this is a really popular route. So it's a way to protect the fragile alpine environment. It also goes through a series of forest types. This one was called the Enchanted Forest. And this plant on the right is called the pandanus, which is one of the world's largest heath plants, as it turns out. Australia is a land of extremes, bigs and smalls, and just really interesting things. And these forests are just really incredible to walk through. Also, we saw quite a bit of wildlife, and including the adorable, this is the forest dwelling patamelon, which is just found in Tasmania. And it's a small kangaroo-like critter, which is super cute. And, we'd run into these guys in the evening. And then the less cute, but sort of equally interesting, this is a wombat. It's also a marsupial. And the Echidna, which is part of a group of mammals that actually lays eggs and is called a monotreme. So monotremes are mammals that lay eggs, and the Echidna and the platypus are two of the mammals that belong in that group. They're also sometimes called the spiny anteaters, even though they aren't related to anteaters, because they have a similar food source and they grub and dig like anteaters do. We were really blessed with good weather on our trip, and so we were able to go up onto this ridge and climb Mount Oakley, which is a really beautiful summit area up there. And from there, we could overlook the ancient forests, and in particular, the King Billy pine. The king billy pine is a tree like our giant sequoia. It can live to be close to 2,000 years old. So it has really high value to scientists who are trying to put together historic and prehistoric or historic climate records, looking at fire intervals and changes in climate. So it's a really important tree for scientists studying climate change. And just beautiful, beautiful vistas, and a really happy group to have made the climb and made the peak. It was just a super fun group. You know, the Aussies, again, if you've been there, they're just really outgoing folks that really like to have a lot of fun. So we enjoyed our time with them immensely. We figured that the rains were going to come, and they eventually did, sort of in the middle of our trip when we were down more in the forests. And we ended up having some epic rains that even our guides had never seen, that led to flooding that we had to deal with that was pretty intense. But, you know, we were kind of okay with it because we had our super duper raincoats and our pack covers and really nice accommodations. They made fresh bread for us every single night. So somebody would hike ahead, make a loaf of bread for us, and have a bottle of wine and cheese when we showed up. So we were pretty pampered, which was really, really nice. And, you know, we were able to get warm and dry each night. So it worked out. And those little plastic boxes that you see, those are our lunches. So we were issued a little plastic box each day, and they would pack us these really yummy light lunches that we would just eat somewhere out along the trail. So it was pretty fun. Fortunately, we only had rain for a couple days, and it eventually dried out, and we were able to dry out and continue our walk and make our way down to St. Clair Lake. This is the river coming into the lake, so we knew our trek was almost over. And then the end, we took a boat ride across the lake back to civilization. But I gotta say, it was just a fabulous, fabulous trip. We were really fortunate to be able to have that. From there, we went to the Port Arthur Historic Site. And this is the area where the Brits formed the Penal Colony in the early 1800s that lasted for about 50 years in this area. We've all heard how the Brits sent, you know, their prisoners to Australia in the 1800s, and it's something I've always been kind of curious to learn more about. So one of the things that I learned is that they were sent there for two reasons. The first reason was that back then their prisons in the UK were getting really overcrowded. And so they were running out of spaces to put people. And then the other thing is they were trying to create a workforce in their new colony to beat out some of the other countries that were, you know, trying to lay claim to Australia. So they sent people down there for, you know, what was essentially forced labor. The Port Arthur prison is known for being a particularly difficult prison. The conditions were really, really horrible, and they sent what they considered sort of their worst prisoners. But while they were there, you know, they used people for shipbuilding, shoemaking, iron working, and brick making. It's really interesting because when you go there, this is a National Historic Preservation Site, and I also believe it's a World Heritage Center, but I'm not sure. I thought I saw that, but I have looked at so much stuff. But anyway, you can see the remnants of the station there, and because this was a prison, you know, the guards and their families were living there. So what you see now are just the remnants of the buildings of the prisons themselves. This one on the lower left with the windows, that's a prison. You know, you can see the guard station here. This was what's left of the hospital. You know, they had a church there. So it was a very remote outpost town, and it was stressful for everybody. It's a really interesting and very sobering place to go, and they have a very interesting way of presenting the history there. It was definitely worth it. And we spent a whole day. You can take a boat ride, and they take you out because there's some other islands out there that are part of the colony that they talk to you about. So it's a very, very interesting place to be. And one thing is, and I had read this a while back, but for a long time in Australia and Tasmania, people were really kind of shamed and hid any relations that they would have had to prisons who were here back then. But now it's sort of become a badge of honor. And I think there's only about 20% of the Aussies who can have direct ties back to prisoners who came from the UK in the 1800s, but they kind of wear it like a badge of honor now. You know, people want to check their genealogy and see if they have family members that were back for prisoners. So it's just interesting how perceptions of history and what happened sort of change over time. But you know, today there's just a lot of the guided walks, and the grounds are beautiful. I mean, it's sort of this juxtaposed position of beautiful grounds and a really harsh history. The other thing that we wanted to see while we were there is the Tasmanian Devil. And it turns out that the Tasmanian Devil is really, really hard to see because the population is really endangered. So mostly where you need to go to see it are rescue centers. And we went to this place called the Unzoo to see it. And although it was once distributed widely through mainland Australia, it's only limited to small pockets of Tasmania due to mostly habitat destruction. But since 1996, the Tasmanian Devil has been threatened by a contagious cancer called the devil facial tumor disease. And I had heard about this before we were over there, but I didn't know much about it. So this produces large tumors around the mouth and face of the Tasmanian Devil, and they tend to grow and make it so that the animals can't eat and they eventually starve. And it turns out it's caused by a unique line of infectious cells produced by the devils themselves, and then they're transmitted to each other through fighting, either in mating or during feeding, because they're scavengers. And so, you know, they will try to push other devils off if they think that they have a better shot at getting whatever the food is. So there's been a huge effort over the last 20 plus years to rescue these animals and rehabilitate the ones that they can, but they don't release them into the wild because they're concerned that they could respread the virus. So they end up in a lot of these rescue centers, and it's places where people, visitors can go and see them. You make donations or pay a fee, and a lot of the money is then donated to research. So they're trying really hard to create some populations of healthy devils that they can release into protected areas in Tasmania to get, a natural healthy population, but it's really kind of slow going for them. But they, they're kind of creepy little things in some ways, but they're amazingly cute in others. And these are also marsupials as well, but they're just carnivorous. They're meat eaters, but definitely something I had wanted to see. This area also, because it's a rescue center, they do a lot of programs for kids. So they had the kangaroos, they had patamelons there, and they also have the series of some of the really small nocturnal marsupials that are really hard to see, and a lot of them are really endangered. And this is called the eastern quaal. It's also referred to as the native cat because it's, sort of looks a little like a cat. Again, it's a marsupial. It's carnivorous. It's really endangered as well. A lot of these are endangered because of habitat loss. There's a tremendous amount of, forest production, resource activity, a lot of farming. One thing that we found out that was kind of mind-numbing is Tasmania makes a large amount of its money from opium production that goes into morphine. So it's, you drive by these opium fields with big signs that say, do not approach, don't eat, don't, whatever. Some people will, try to defy that and go in and get sick. But because so much of the state of Tasmania has been converted into agriculture in one way or another, these critters are losing their historic ranges. And then the other thing that's really, really hard on these small nocturnal marsupials is roadkill. The roads over there are super narrow, really dark, and really windy, and people drive like maniacs. So there's just a tremendous amount of roadkill over there. And so there's been a really, really big effort to educate people to slow down at night, because these guys aren't really fast moving. So, you know, they're trying to educate people to drive slower, be more aware. And again, if you've been there, you've probably seen a lot of people have those sort of, I don't know what you call them, those big lights that they mount on the side of the vehicle that give them more light range where they can see further down the road, that live in these more remote places. But, you know, they're, although they have, you know, a lot going against them, they're really working hard to try to conserve what they have, both in, you know, in habitat area and the critters themselves. So, you know, that's all you can hope for. So I think that kind of wraps up my talk for today. As usual, you know, some of my pictures I was able to download from other stuff. This is a series of sites that I use to get some of my information. This, you know, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer if I can, and hopefully you enjoyed the talk.
Thank you, Claudette.